Aion, why eternal punishment is not biblical. Most Christians today, certainly in the English-speaking world, think of eternal punishment as a critical church doctrine because most popular English Bible translations today use that very phrase, eternal punishment. But what you are not aware of is that phrase, eternal punishment, does not come out of the original language of the New Testament. The New Testament was written in Koine Greek. That phrase, eternal punishment, comes right out of Latin translations of the Bible. Eternal is the Latin word aeternum. That's where we get the word eternal from the Latin. It's pulled straight out of Latin translations of the Bible. It was not taken from the original Greek language of the Bible. What's actually in the Greek language is the Greek word aion, and adjectives derived from aion, and aion merely means an age. 19th century classic scholar and linguist Frederick Farrar writes, aion, Hebrew olam, means properly an age, an indefinite period, long or short. The phrases which are asserted to imply endlessness are again and again used of things which have long since ceased to be. And Farrar is referring to the usage of the Greek word aion in the Septuagint and other classical Greek literature. In this presentation, I'm going to show why the Greek word aion and its derivatives and duplications do not mean eternal or forever, especially in relationship to punishment in the Bible. Now, earlier I did a presentation on this topic in response to a comment made by a pastor here at this channel. And I'm going to quote from him towards the end of this presentation. I'm going to leave him anonymous, but I'm going to quote from him because his reaction is very stereotypical. But first I want to start by quoting from some scholars who are experts in this area of classical Greek literature and hear what they say. Quoting from John Wesley Hansen's treatise on this topic, he writes, "The oldest lexicographer, AD 400 to 600, defines aion thus: the life of man, the time of life. At this early date, no theologian had yet imported into the word the meaning of endless duration. It retained only the sense it had in the classics and in the Bible." Hansen also records that a lexicographer from the 16th century named Favorinus was compelled to notice an addition which subsequently to the time of the famous Council of 544 had been grafted onto the word. He says aion, time, also life, also habit or way of life. Aion is also the eternal and the endless, as it seems to the theologian. You see, Favorinus, this lexicographer Favorinus in the 16th century, knew that extra meaning was added on to the word by theologians sometime in the Middle Ages. And as I already pointed out, that meaning of eternity actually comes from the Latin. They translated the Greek word aion and its adjectives as aeternum in Latin Bibles, which were very popular, and changed the meaning of the word. Basically, this idea that aion means eternity is a kind of circular reasoning going on with theologians in the Middle Ages. The Latin word aeternum means eternity, and so what they did is they assumed that that must be the meaning of the Greek word aion. They're taking the meaning of the Latin word and imposing it backward onto the Greek. But the Bible wasn't written in Latin originally. It was written in Koine Greek. And so it's the definition of the Greek word aion that we need to look at when we're translating the Bible into English, not what they did in the Latin. You see, the Greek word aion most closely resembles the word eon in English, which is in use by cosmologists and geologists, and it doesn't mean forever. Their usage of it denotes long time frames. And the original meaning of the Greek word aion, where we get our word eon or age, is that of a human lifespan, the age of a human lifespan. So approximately 100 years is how they viewed it. Regarding the definition of the Greek word aion, Dr. Edward Beecher remarks, "It commonly means merely continuity of action. All attempts to set forth eternity as the original and primary sense of aion are at war with the facts of the Greek language for 5 centuries, in which it denoted life and its derivative senses, and the sense of eternity was unknown. And then Dr. Beecher went on to note that the classical authors outside the Bible, such as Homer or Herodotus, clearly understood that Aion meant a limited duration roughly that of a human lifespan. The concept of eternity in Aion is nowhere to be found in classical Greek. Some have tried to claim that Aion in adjective form could mean eternity. Addressing that erroneous notion, a 19th century theologian quoted by John Wesley Hanson states the following: that Aionian does not mean endless or eternal may appear from considering that no adjective can have a greater force than the noun from which it is derived. If Aion means age, which none either will or can deny, then Aionian must mean age lasting, or duration through the age or ages to which the thing spoken or relates. Confirming the same thing, 19th century classic scholar and linguist Frederick Farrar writes, since Aion meant an age, Aionius means properly belonging to an age, or age long, and anyone who asserts that it must always mean endless defends a position that even Augustine practically abandoned 12 centuries ago. Even if Aion always meant eternity, which is not the case in either classical or Hellenistic Greek, Aionius could still only mean belonging to eternity, not lasting through it. Aionius does not even mean endless within the sphere of its own existence. Now, Farrar is an interesting theologian in that he didn't declare himself to be a universalist per se, but rather he held the position that universal reconciliation was God's intention, and based on Scripture was an outcome that we must consider. His point being that the adjective forms of Aion used throughout the New Testament to describe punishment could never mean eternity, even if the Greek word Aion could sometimes mean eternity based on the context. Farrar goes on to say, the word by itself, whether adjective or substantive, never means endless. Aionios may in some instances connote endlessness because it catches something of its color from the words to which it is joined. Just as the word indefinite might catch the sense of infinite if, in speaking of things which for other reasons I knew to be infinite in duration, I spoke of them as being of indefinite duration, it is a word which, like many other adjectives, shines simply by reflected light. So basically, Farrar is telling us that the idea of eternity can only be reflected back upon this adjective based on the context of the noun being described, such as if we were talking about God himself, the nature of God. But nothing about the noun punishment reflects eternity onto an adjective that merely means age, roughly the length of a human lifespan, especially if we are reading about a just God in the Bible. And Hanson goes on to note that there are plenty of Greek words and phrases that literally mean eternal or forever or endless, but the New Testament writers never employ those words to describe punishment. They just don't. Hanson writes, some years since Reverend Ezra S. Goodwin patiently and candidly traced this word through the classics, finding the noun frequently in nearly all writers, but not meeting the adjective until Plato, its inventor, used it. He states, as the result of his protracted and exhaustive examination from the beginning down to Plato, we have the whole evidence of 7 Greek writers extending through about 6 centuries down to the age of Plato who make use of the word Aion in common with other words, and no one of them ever employs it in the sense of eternity. Plato's use of the adjective Aionian clearly demonstrates he did not understand it as eternal. Plato describes certain souls as being in Aionian intoxication, and then he says, it is a very ancient opinion that souls quitting this world repair to the infernal regions and return after that to live in this world. So Plato, who had, pagan ideas of the afterlife, viewed the word Aionian that he coined, that adjective, as souls go into Ionian intoxication and then they come back to this world. So it's a period of time and then they come back. So if Aion means forever, that would fly in the face of the uniform usage of the word and its adjectives in classical Greek literature. That would mean that this new meaning of Aion as eternity suddenly appeared in the New Testament out of nowhere. But referring to this doctrine of eternal punishment that we got out of the Latin, John Wesley Hansen remarks, "A doctrine, if true, ought to crowd every sentence, frown in every line, only stated 14 times, and that too by a word whose uniform meaning everywhere else is limited duration. The idea is preposterous. Such reticence is incredible." So Hansen, in his treatise on the Greek word aion, notes that there are plenty of Greek words and phrases, such as aidios, that mean endlessness, forever. But if a doctrine that is so important for us to understand, such as eternal punishment, were true, why in the world are they using this word that uniformly means a limited duration of time everywhere else in classical Greek writings? And even worse, the New Testament writers themselves demonstrate that is their understanding of this word and its adjectives. So back to this pastor who left a comment on one of my videos, a short video I did, pointing out that phrase in the book of Revelation, forever and ever, actually should be translated as in the age of ages. And he writes, "Sorry, this argument is based upon a literal word-for-word translation. Anyone who knows more than one language knows this is not how languages are translated. The term eyes, toes, Ionius, tone, Ionian, which the person in this video says should be translated as in the age of ages, is used in the following verses as forever and ever. If the term is only meant to refer to a limited time period, then you have to apply that translation, which would be temporal and limited, to the rest of the verses which that exact Greek construction appears." And of course, respectfully, I do appreciate this pastor being willing to stop by and make this challenge. And I want to respond to it. I'm glad he made the challenge because it gives me an opportunity to explain why that phrase in the book of Revelation should be translated as in the age of ages, which is what is literally in the Greek, and not forever and ever. And so, quoting from a verse that he posted as one of his examples that should be translated as forever and ever, he asserts, "And there will no longer be any night, and they will not have need of the light of the lamp, nor the light of the sun, because the Lord God will illumine them, and they will reign forever and ever." Revelation 22:5 in the NASB. So that sounds really nice. They reign forever and ever, and we're used to seeing that. But as I previously pointed out, that idea is contradicted by the Apostle Paul. So as I previously pointed out, the Apostle Paul very specifically tells us that this age of ages, that's translated as forever and ever in popular Bibles, actually comes to an end. He writes, "Then the end will come when he hands over the kingdom to God the Father, after he has destroyed all dominion, authority, and power. For he must reign until he has put all of his enemies under his feet. The last enemy to be destroyed is death." So very specifically, Paul tells us that this reign, even Christ himself, only reigns until he has put all of his enemies under his feet. And then he hands the kingdom over to his Father, who is unseen, that God may be all in all. In other words, mankind does not need a visible kingdom government forever and ever, only until all of Christ's enemies have been brought into submission before him. So Paul tells us at the culmination of this age of ages, or ages of ages, this long time frame, at the end of this period of time, once Christ is completely victorious and all of his enemies have come into submission to him, then all dominion, authority, and power is abolished by Christ. The kingdom government, the visible kingdom government, is no longer needed. Mankind doesn't need a babysitter forever and ever. At some point, we are all going to be connected with the Father, just like Christ is, and we're going to listen to the Father, and we all just do the right thing. And this is a beautiful thing that Paul is telling us, that at some point in time, mankind is going to live together in perfect harmony with each other and with the Father, and we don't need a government to keep us in line forever and ever. And I also pointed out that Aion in these adjectives can't mean forever. If they did, that would mean Satan's kingdom is forever in Ephesians 2:2, in which you once walked following the course of this world, the Iona, following the prince of the power of the air, the spirit that is now working in the sons of disobedience. So very clearly this noun Iona does not mean forever and ever or eternity, because obviously Satan's kingdom is not for eternity. But the NASB and other popular Bible translations translate this exact same noun in Jude 1:13 as forever. They are wild waves of the sea, casting up their own shame like foam, wandering stars for whom the black darkness has been reserved forever. Iona. So as I just pointed out, obviously Iona cannot mean forever in one passage, yet in the passage where punishment is, they translate it as forever. Obviously, this is absurd. Punishment does not reflect the idea of eternity back onto a word that means limit to duration everywhere else in classical Greek literature. So, as these scholars pointed out, the idea of reflecting back the idea of eternity or forever onto a Greek word that doesn't mean forever everywhere else in Greek classical literature, that can only happen if something in the context really forces that understanding back onto the word. And I do give an example of this in Hebrews 13:8. Jesus Christ is the same yesterday and today and forever. And of course that word forever is into the ages. And that translation of forever is not the literal meaning of the word there, but the idea is there because of the nature of who Christ is. I could translate that same passage and say Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. So even if I use the word tomorrow, just like the word yesterday is in the passage, yesterday doesn't mean Jesus Christ was merely that way yesterday. It means Jesus was always that way. And if I use the word tomorrow, I would understand that means Jesus is always that way, tomorrow and tomorrow, because that is the nature of who Christ is, not because of the meaning of the word tomorrow or the meaning of the word yesterday in the passage. We understand this from the context of the passage, that the nature of Christ is being reflected back on the word yesterday, and the nature of Christ is being, in the same way, reflected back on the word tomorrow. Or in the case of the actual Greek, it's being reflected back on the Greek word aion. But that understanding is an extrapolation from the context, who we're talking about, not the literal meaning of aion. Now, Hansen, in his treatise on the Greek word aion, notes that there are plenty of words that would strongly convey the idea of eternal punishment that were available to the New Testament writers, but they never employ them. And he notes that the Pharisees, who some of which believed in eternal punishment, and they got that concept coming out of Babylon, it's in the book of Enoch and so forth. And Josephus writes that they, the Pharisees, believe that souls of the bad are allotted aidios erigmos, an eternal prison, and punished with adaileptos timoria, eternal retribution. You see, the Greek word, for example, aidios, literally means endless or eternal, unless some limiting factor is placed upon it in the context of the passage. Whereas the Greek word aion is completely the opposite. It means a limited time frame and age, unless some other context is reflecting back the meaning of eternity, such as the nature of God or the nature of Christ. You see, if the New Testament writers wanted to convey the idea of eternal punishment, it's not because the Greek language didn't have those words and phrases. Most certainly did, but they never employ them related to punishment. In one place, we see the word aidios, which literally means forever or eternal, used in the book of Jude, in Jude 1:6. But Jude puts a limiting factor on it and says that they are punished aidios, placed in prison, until the judgment. You see what he did? So in that sense, he's saying it is perpetual, unending, until the judgment. And as I pointed out at the beginning, this idea of eternal punishment comes from the Latin word aeternum. And it's the Latin manuscripts that gave us this idea of eternal punishment. The Greek word aion doesn't mean eternal. It's the Latin word aeternum that means eternal. But ironically, this concept of eternal punishment is even more forced upon us in English translations of the Bible than it even was in Latin manuscripts. Because in the book of Revelation, the Latin manuscripts agree with me in the Age of Ages. You see, the Latin manuscripts translate the phrase Ionius ton Ionian as secula seculorum. In the Oxford Classical Dictionary, we have the definition of seculum. The seculum, defined as the longest span of human life, was fixed in the Republic as an era of 100 years. So this word seculum, used in the book of Revelation in the Latin manuscripts, closely matches the classical usage of the Greek word aion, roughly the length of a human lifetime. In Latin, they boiled it down to exactly 100 years, a seculum. And interestingly, John Wycliffe, in the Wycliffe Bible that came before the King James, translating right out of the Latin, he translates that same phrase in Revelation as world of worlds. And somehow he's pulling that phrase from the Latin, secula seculorum. I suppose, in a sense, a world that existed 100 years ago is now gone and over. Limited duration, even in the Wycliffe translation. So where in the world did this idea of forever and ever punishment in the book of Revelation come from? Because it's not in the Latin and it's not in the Greek. It doesn't even appear in the Wycliffe Bible. So it appears that the King James translators just pulled that out of nowhere and coined that. But actually, that's not true. I know where they got it. They got it from William Tyndale. In the Tyndale Bible, that passage reads, "shall be tormented day and night forevermore." So the King James translators actually got that from William Tyndale's phrase, forevermore. And William Tyndale has no precedent for that, but it came from William Tyndale, sadly. And most of the King James Bible is actually William Tyndale's work. Most people don't know that, but it's actually the work of one man, William Tyndale. But interestingly, in Old English, as we read in the 1828 Webster's Dictionary, the word forever doesn't necessarily literally mean forever. They wrote, in the more lax sense, this word signifies continually, for an indefinite period. As his master shall bore his ear through with the awl, and he shall serve him forever. Well, just for his lifetime, right? For his aion. So the question is when William Tyndale coined that phrase forevermore, that ended up being forever and ever in the King James translation, did William Tyndale mean that in the lax sense, like we see in Latin, the seculum being a human lifetime, or in Greek, the aion is a human lifetime? Did William Tyndale mean that in the lax sense? Because in Old English, it could have that meaning. But we may never know. I can't read his mind. But the idea of forever and ever punishment originates in English. It wasn't even in the Latin translations. And the Latin translations is where we got this concept of eternal punishment, where in other places they use that word, the Latin word aeternum, eternal, to refer to punishment. But even in the book of Revelation, the Latin doesn't force that upon us. It's only in English that this idea of forever and ever punishment is being forced upon us in translation. It's worse for us today than it was even in the Dark Ages. So we need to understand that this concept of eternal punishment or forever and ever punishment is not biblical. It is not what the apostles wrote. It's not in the original language. I know there are the King James only people out there who tell me that the King James Bible is the true Word of God in English. Now, I am not putting down the King James translation. The King James translation has done an enormous amount of good for Christians in the English-speaking world. But the true Word of God was not written in English. It was written in Greek, in Hebrew, in Aramaic. And these concepts of punishment in the New Testament, to understand them, we do need to go back to the real Bible, to the Greek, and understand that this Greek word aion does not mean forever. It does not mean eternity. God's punishments are very specifically, in the Greek, temporary. God's punishments are corrective in nature and come to an end. In the New Testament, there are many adjectives that describe God's nature, but there are only 3 nouns that describe who God is. God is light, God is life, and God is love. Those are the only 3 nouns that describe who God is. Obviously, a God who tortures people for all eternity is not a God of light, is not a God of life, and is not a God of love. And that is why I am shining a bright light on this false doctrine of eternal punishment. I want you to see where it came from. I want you to understand that it is a false doctrine and should rightly be rejected by all Christians. Yes, the Bible does teach that God will punish evildoers, but it does not teach that God punishes people for all eternity. The word pictures being used in the Bible and the words being used to describe punishment are ideas like the refining of gold or the pruning back of a tree, corrective chastisement. God's punishments, just like everything else, are rooted in his nature of love and goodness and have a purpose in mind. Because God is light, God is life, and God is love. God bless you. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.